Buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Quería disculparme que no hablaré en castellano o en español, pero no quería torturarles con mi mal mezcla de italiano y de español y con ese acento bastante teutónico. Por eso presentaré mis pensamientos y también mis resultados empíricos de una investigación o de investigaciones sobre los regímenes políticos en el mundo contemporáneo. Esto es mi cognitive map, and now I'm switching to English. But most of my transparencias will be in Spanish. This is a cognitive map with which I will guide you through my presentation. I will first give you just a simple empirical view about the development, the empirical development of democracies since the fall of the last right-wing dictatorships in Europe, meaning in Portugal, Greece, and of course Spain in '75. Then I will present you a very specific concept of democracy where I do think this concept has analytical advantages compared to other concepts in order to evaluate, to investigate the trajectory of democratic development. And then I will present you a subtype of democracy which we find quite often among the new democracies which emerged after 1974. I will talk a bit about which causes do cause the emergence of these diminished subtypes of democracy. And then I will end at the end, after having given you some examples on America Latina, where I do think at present these are the weakest spots of the democratic world. And here the chain, to use an expression of, I think it was not Marx, it was Lenin, the chain can break. So the success of democratization during the last 30 years may have an Achilles heel in Latin America, and I will explain why. And at the end, I will focus on a very specific problem, which is the relation between the Estado de Derecho y la democracia. And this is a problem, especially for a kind of growth industry we have seen during the last 20 years, meaning the promotion of democracy. So the Western countries spend billions of dollars and euro in promoting democracy, without war, by the way, of promoting democracy all over the globe. Very specific European or US American democracies. And I will hint at a very specific fact how important the rule of law is for democracy. Just a brief look how the political regimes developed. If we oversimplify the picture, we can divide political regimes in three different types. The first are democracies. This is the green line you see here. The second are dictatorship. This is a red line. And then there's obviously a regime which is somewhere in between. Think about Russia. Think about Venezuela. Are these dictatorships? Are these democracies? Not so easy to answer. I will come to this point later on. But what we see here is, starting from 1974 or 75, there is a steep increase of democracies in the world. And here at this first peak after the collapse of the communist regime, regimes, democratization in Asia, democratization in Latin America, the famous ensayo of Fukuyama appeared, The End of History. So Fukuyama, with this crude, oversimplistic Hegelian view of the world, was simply observing what is happening, and here then he wrote his essay. So the competition between democracies and dictatorships are over. The competition between planning economies and capitalism is decided again in favor of capitalism. So what happened then? Then we have a kind of stagnation, and here there is a slight increase, but during the last 5 years there is an decrease of democracies, which caused US American colleagues in foreign affairs, in other reviews, talking about the return of dictatorships, and very often without a question mark. So I do think this is empirically wrong, or it's not sustainable. However, there is a vivid discussion now in the United States whether this is over. What is completely clear is there is a decline of open dictatorships, of open autocratic regimes. But what we see here, and this is a very conservative estimation, we see an increase of so-called gray zone regimes, of hybrid regimes. I will come back to this point. This is just a simple empirical overview. This is somewhat complicated, and I don't explain. This is a rather complicated statistic analysis we employed in order to estimate the survival of different political regimes and to make the difficult story somewhat under-complex. You see that here you have the years of existence of a political regimes, and here you have the probability that this regime changes or becomes stable. And if it falls, so to say, from the beginning, then it is extremely unstable. This you see with a hybrid regime. In the first years of the existence, almost after 5 years, they changed. They changed either to democracies or they changed to dictatorships. And after 25 years of an existing hybrid regimes, there's a low probability that this regime will change. Democracy after, let's say here, after 16, 17 years becomes extremely democracies become extremely stable. The risky period are the first 5 to 7 years. Again, this is only a statistical analysis, so-called survival analysis, nothing else. We don't talk here about the reasons for it, just taking 35 years and about 500 different regimes into the statistical calculation. One additional information why it may matter that we distinguish between different political regimes. So one could argue this is a typical German thing. The Germans, since Max Weber, like typologies, and they have to typologize the whole world, otherwise they do not understand it completely. But what I want to show here is how problematic these hybrid regimes can be if it comes to the essential question of war and peace. We were looking since 45 to 2000 on interstate wars, meaning there must be per year defined a war more than 1,000 killed people, then statistically it's called a war. And we were only looking to civil wars, to intra-state wars. And democracies, even you have a very loose concept of democracy, having for some time also Pakistan, India, and these countries subsumed under democracy. You have only 12 of these wars, and dictatorships are quite good as well, only 33. But hybrid regimes are extremely belligerent, and this is something what the promoters of democracy in the ministers of desarrollo should think about. Very often they trigger early elections, and what then happened, these regimes do not transite to liberal, stable democracy. They very often remain in this hybrid gray zone, and in these zones the state very often loses the grip on the behavior of the people, and you have very often, or in an enormous way, civil wars. So if you start, for example, to, let's say, democratize Algeria, can be quite risky, and the West tried to promote it. You may not remember 1991, an Islamic Salvation Front won the elections, promoted free election, promoted by the West, and then the West, especially the European Union and the United States of America, were completely surprised that not one of them won the rather fair election. But it was an Islamic party which had a dubious, doubtless, a dubious position towards democracy. And then the West, France, United States, in the forefront thought the militaries maybe, or the military regime may be a bastard regime, but these are more rational bastards. And these are, in the words of Henry Kissinger, these can be our bastards. But the Salvation Front is something risky. And I will not engage too much into this point. The United States are, in a way, stepped away from promoting democracies almost everywhere, especially in the Islamic world. They became extremely cautious after the military adventure of Bush, especially in Iraq. Let me come, after these rather simple empirical results, let me come to a conceptual debate. If I would ask you, and if I would ask you what democracy really is, we would get more than 1 dozen different definitions. The same is true if we talk about socialism. The same is true if we talk about nationalism. Therefore, it should be one of the exercises we have to do, really, to explain what we mean by it. And again, to simplify this complex world, we can distinguish 3 different approaches. The first one are the minimalists. The minimalists, and this is the dominant position in the empirical democracy research in the Anglo-Saxon world, they are arguing free and fair elections is enough. So let's call them the electoralist. Electoral democracy is the minimalist concept, and there are prestigious theoreticians like Schumpeter, Robert Dahl, or Adam Jaworski. They use this. They don't want to have more. The core of democracy is our free and fair election. I'm rather skeptical about this point of view, and I come back. Then we have the maximalists. The maximalists are arguing you need, of course, free and fair election, but you need more. You need un Estado de Derecho, rule of law. This would be by especially US American theorists, they refuse to see rule of law as an integral part of democracy. I come back to this point as well, but this is even not enough for maximalists. Maximalists are also looking not only to the input, not only to institutions and procedures and norms. They are looking to the output, to the outcome. Which kind of policies will be produced by the political regime? And very often they argue there must be a certain understanding of social justice. This was a German constitutionalist in the 1920s, just before Hitler came into power, Hermann Heller, but you find this very often in Latin American democratic theories as well. I'm skeptical about this as well. Social justice is an even more problematic thing. If we would ask, for example, the population in Sweden, and we did, and we have significant surveys about this, and you ask people in the United States, you will get a complete different understanding what social justice means, and a very different understanding which role the market, which role the state should play. So I would propose to you, for my research here, so to say, a mid-range approach, which I have called embedded democracy. And by embedded democracy, I mean the following. Probably you cannot, only the first row probably can read it. Here you have the minimalist core. This means free and fair elections. But these free and fair elections can only be democratically meaningful if you have guaranteed political rights. They must be guaranteed. Otherwise, to go to election loses a lot of its meaning if they are under threat, if certain groups of the people will be kept away from the polls and so forth. There must be also what I call here the Estado de Derecho and the especially civil rights. Civic rights are something which are closely interconnected with political rights. You must have checks and balances, and here this is quite a strange, what I call a partial regime. This is a way, not strange, but if you look to many of these political regimes in Latin America or Asia, the elected government must have the sole right to govern. There should be not any veto actors like militias, like military groups, and even big multinationals who interfere into the business. So if, for example, the military argues, you elected government, you can do everything, economic policy, social policy, you can organize a judiciary, but if it comes to security policy, then it's our deal. And there are still quite a lot of so-called electoral regimes where the military plays this important role. My argument now here, that's why I call them embedded democracy. These 5 partial regimes of democracy are normatively and functionally close connected. They cannot function without each other. This is my first argument. This is the internal embeddedness. But there is also an external embeddedness you have here. External embeddedness, these are these 3 rings around the political regime. The first is, I call the estatalidad, the degree of stateness, the efficiency of the administration and bureaucracy. If a state does not have such a bureaucracy, then the parliament can decide, but these democratically decided topics and outputs and decisions and law will not be implemented. This is even in countries like Brazil, where which made tremendous progress during the last 10 years in enhancing the quality of democracy. There are certain, as Guillermo O'Donnell said, brown areas, meaning the central government does not really govern in these provinces, for example. This is a disease you find in many young democracies in Asia and in Latin America. I don't have to talk here at this faculty about Sociedad Civil. This is certainly something which I argue is not definitional part of democracy, but enhances the quality of democracy and stabilizes democracy and immunizes democracy against external shock. The more vital civil society is, the better for democracy, but democracies can survive without strong civil societies. This is a matter of dispute, and please come forward with your arguments against it. And here you have something which matters very much. This is the socio-economic context. We do not have in social science many so-called iron laws. But if one of these statistical combinations come very close to it, then it is the correlation between the economic development of a country and the chances to be a democracy. What we can call the law of Seymour Martin Lipset, meaning the more well-to-do a country, the more we expect it to be a democracy. This is probably 10,000 and more times calculated again with different data, and this is something which comes very close to an iron law. Of course, we know about some exceptions like the Petro dictatorships in Near East, for example. But this is something which is not really disputed anymore. So the more wealthier countries, the more we can expect democracies. This is what I call the external embeddedness. This matters for the stability, but I don't take this as a definitional part. I don't run through all this. Here you have what I mean by free elections. Here, the civil rights. Here, the effective power to govern. Here, checks and balances. And here, what one could call the public spheres, the public sphere and the political rights. I have talked about these embeddedness, and I would come what I have said already before. There are still types of democracies which are not embedded. So one of these regimes or more of these partial regimes are obviously not working properly. So I would argue, depending which of these 4 or 5 partial regimes is damaged or is not properly working, we have very specific defective democracies which have severe defects. And if, for example, the electoral regime is not properly working, meaning, for example, that certain parts and segments of the population are not allowed to vote. I'm not talking about women, for example, which is part of the first half of the 20th century, and even the seemingly one of the oldest democracies, you know, Switzerland in 1970, we should not call a democracy. 50% of the people were not allowed to vote. But in all the textbooks, Switzerland always appears as something we would, of course, today not accept it anymore. But these are not the cases of today. The cases are more literacy, or the short times when Thailand had, for example, a democracy. Only those people could get elected into parliament who have at least a bachelor degree. So if you don't have a university degree, you do not have the right to be elected. This is what I would call a defect electoral regime, especially if you know that probably only 3% of the whole population holds such a degree. This is, by the way, one of the Asian diseases, meaning that the oligarchia in these countries have also some institutions which safeguard, so to say, their privileged position. And Thailand is certainly one of these cases. Or you look to Latvia, you look to Estonia. Still, those parts of the population born in the country, like the Russians, have it's extremely difficult for them during the last, now somewhat easier, to become citizenship. So a considerable part did not come in. So this is not something of the past. There are only different forms. What the most cases we have found among these 120 electoral democracies in the world, among 200 states, is a deficit in liberal rights, in civic rights. Very often here you have the biggest deficit. This is what we call illiberal democracies. And if there is a regime where the military, militias, organized crime, and others, or multinational firms intervene into the affairs of the government, we call them democracias tuteladas, or domain democracies, because certain domain are taken off the elected institutions. And then what, again, a term which I have borrowed from O'Donnell, meaning if you have not only a deficit in checks and balances, but you have a populist, charismatic leader, for example, then you have what he called democracias delegativas. The people delegate their mandate to the grand leader, not to the parliament, but to those people like Fujimori, 92, or Lukashenko in Bielorussia in 1996, or probably Hugo Chavez also. These are delegative democracies which violate checks and balances, but they have a mandate to some extent, a direct democratic mandate, and you cannot really only explain it by manipulation. The people vote for these diminished subtypes of democracy. Very briefly, which kind of causes do we know why these transitional democracies do not become liberal democracies as the member states of the European Union, for example, are? Even here, there are 2 or 3 where I do have my doubts. I don't run through all these, but what we know, if the processes of modernization were highly unequal, meaning there is a center and there are peripheries. So an unequal process of modernization, a modern center and a backward-oriented periphery is a problem for the development of stable democracies. I was already talking about this iron law of Lipset, the more well-to-do. Economic crises play an important role at the beginning for defective democracies, or even the slippery slope towards dictatorship, especially in times of economic crisis. Presidents, much more presidents than prime ministers, presidents then take one of these norms and institutions you find in almost each democratic constitution, emergency law. And then they do not govern through parliament, but they govern by decree. And they do it for 6 months, and then the sunset laws are over, but then they start again doing a new one. and we have cases where more of the laws were issued by the executive than the parliament, which is something not acceptable in democracies. People like Menem, people like Fujimori in the 1990s, and extremely Boris Yeltsin, much more than Putin, for example. And anyway, I don't believe the story. Under Yeltsin, Russia was a democracy, and then under Putin became an autocracy. This is something ridiculous, superficial, but very often portrayed in many of, not only in the media, but in serious political analyses as well. So emergency laws are very often, so to say, the entrance point for these defects. By the way, it was also in the late 1920s and early 1930s in Germany, where the presidents of the Weimar Republic governed by these emergency law. So to say, Hitler did not really capture the political power. He was pushed to some extent into the political power, having had only 34% of the votes in 1932. So emergency laws play an important role. I will be briefer here. Social capital. This is something of a social science growth industry. It is the core of civil society. Social capital is especially mutual trust, the trust between citizens. It's not the trust from citizen towards the government, but how much do the citizens trust their fellow citizens? And we know from empirical research that we have high trust societies. Guess which one? Of course, our nice Nordic, Scandinavian, small countries, high trust societies. You may, in the countryside in Denmark and Sweden, may not lock your bicycle, but if you go to low trust societies, classical Latin American countries, Caracas, or South Africa, Johannesburg, then you have gates in front of the window up to the 8th floor. And of course, after 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, you cannot pass certain areas anymore. And especially the weak and the women are, so to say, restricted, extremely restricted by in their liberties. So trust is something which is closely related to equality and inequality. The more unequal a society is, the less trust you find. This is, again, a very robust correlation. This explains certainly some that you have the lowest trust societies, especially in Latin America, in Nigeria, and so forth. I want to say something more. We know about, again, I like to simplify this evening, we can distinguish between two different types of social capital. The one is called bridging social capital, meaning this is a trust across different religions, across different classes, across different ethnicities. This is the most important kind of social capital which can be produced in societies and which have to be produced in multi-ethnic societies. But on the other hand, you have so-called bonding social capital, meaning producing capital only for one community, for the Serbs, for the Croats, for the Muslim population, or what you can think of. So if you have, very often you find in these societies high trust inside a very narrow defined, let's call them ethnic community, and you have social services and you have quite good understanding, but the outside world is extremely hostile. So if I can provoke the civil society specialists here, Hamas could be called a civil society organization. It is less corrupt than Fatah, is less corrupt than the state. It runs hospital, it runs better schools, but is murderous at its borderlines. Murderous if it comes to the coexistence with Israel. So this would be these kind of, if we talk about civil society or social capital, or you have, especially in the United States, they simply count the number of civic associations, and then they argue the more of these civic organizations have, the more vital, the stronger civil society is. It does not tell you very much, or only at least half of the story. Civil society schools for democracy, as Tocqueville has once called it, or those networks which produce through cooperation social capital, of course, matter. If you have political communities, an expression which I like much more than nation, if you have political communities where you do not have a common identity, or better, a common sense of belongingness, belonging to this community. You can be, for example, French-speaking, German-speaking, Italian-speaking Swiss citizen. You can be such a citizen, but they all accept Switzerland as a common identity. In many multi-ethnic societies, you don't have it. But if you don't have a common identity, it's extremely difficult to create a state, and without state, no democracy. So these are some important links, and if the nation-building process is not completed, it's extremely difficult that democracy can emerge in a stable manner. By the way, it does not matter. This was one of the surprises we found. It does not matter which type of political regime it was before. If you had a military dictatorship, or a highly institutionalized communist regime, or a fascist regime, or some kind of monarchic dictatorships, it doesn't matter. They do not have a better or worse perspective, so there is no correlation. We were highly surprised because we thought that the deeper a dictatorship was really institutionalized, the more difficult it becomes that it transformed to a democracy. We did not find empirical relations to this. Last point, the international context, of course, matters, and what is one of the most decisive things is not only that you have, so to say, what we have seen after the end of Cold War, an international community which was very much keen to develop democracies, but it is even, or the Catholic Church at a certain moment, you are in the second half of the 20th century, was then also more in favor of democracy than dictatorship. You know, in some countries it took longer than in others. But the most important thing is what we call the neighborhood. If a country is surrounded by dictatorships, and you can for a moment have free election and establish the democratic institution, has only a little chance to survive. If you have a country which is embedded in democracies, then there is a much higher chances that this democracy can survive. This was the case in Eastern Europe. And if you compare, for example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and these countries, they consolidated their democracy faster than Portugal and Spain, much faster. Nobody would have expected it at this moment, and this has very much to do with the even stronger role. There are different factors, but one role certainly was the stronger role of the European Union, which was probably the most successful democratizador in all all these countries, but only as long as they could offer membership. They are not very successful if it comes to their policies in Africa or in Asia, for example. So neighborhood matters. This is something which obviously all these eggheads of George W. Bush and so forth should have told him. The greater Middle East strategy was democratize Iraq, then the other autocratic regimes will fall like domino stones. There is no empirical evidence that this will happen. These are the famous cathedral in the desert, which will not really then become democracies. This is too boring here. I just want to argue here what I call, as we come to Latin America, I would consider only 4, or now with Brazil 5, as really established democracies. Most of them are defective with different defects and reason, and Venezuela, according to our counting and all the international democracy indices, now is highly, highly defective, and but I refuse to call it a dictatorship, because it is not a classical dictatorship. As Freedom House, the most influential democracy observing institution, is now arguing for 5 years. Do I still have 10 minutes? Okay. Very brief. Here I was looking to outside the OECD world, outside the industrialized democratic countries, to different regions in the world, and we were looking to the quality, the democratic quality of the political regimes, and East Central Europe and Southeast Europe is certainly the strongest one, then Latin America, and then it goes down to the Middle East, North Africa, which is the deepest autocratic region we have. I don't go for here at this point into the interesting question, why is this the case? You know, you have different hypotheses. The one are arguing it's especially Islam. The others are arguing it is especially because they have oil. If this is a so-called curse of resources, there's a very close relationship of oil exporting countries being dictatorships. I leave this aside. If somebody is interested, we can talk about this in the debate. I want to show you something more interesting. Then I was looking to the Latin American countries, which parts of the democracy is well developed and where do you find the most deficits. And coming out of a student movement in the 1970s, of course, we were all arguing it must be participation. Political participation is the most important thing, and then the core of democracy is established. What we have seen in these countries is, you see this line, this is especially the political rights, and it is free and fair election, what I call here the polyarchic elements. It is especially electoral rights and free election, quite well developed. 10 would be the optimal for the region which was reached by Uruguay, for example. But then, if you look, we looked to other indicators representing rule of law. You see here this gap between them. So the problem is not participation, it's not political rights, it is civil rights, it is the rule of law, which is highly deficient. And we also have seen that if you have a weak Estado de Derecho, then this kind of virus spread to all the other partial regimes I have shown to you, to civil rights, to political rights at the end. So it is very of the entrance of the defects we have seen a weak rule of law. You see, this is not only the speciality of the Latin American countries. I have looked at the East European countries. Here you see the white columns are participation and the black ones are rule of law. You have the same problem in these countries as well. This would be worldwide. Here you have participation 2006, and here was 2003, and the blue line. So you have here 131 countries, and here you have the development of rule of law. I come very soon to the end, and as I have told you, there is a close correlation between the level of economic development and wealth of a country and here you see the quality of democracy. The higher the national income is, the more you find democracies, and there are only, if it is more than $9,000 per capita, there are only a few regimes which are not democracy. And there's even a more robust correlation. If a country which is above $9,000 per capita has become a democracy, it will not collapse anymore. Though this is the robustest correlation, it will not collapse come hell or high water. So Ramon asked me when he picked me up from the airport, the economic crisis now in Europe, will it be a problem for the stability of democracy? And I said, Margaret, no, I don't believe. These democracies are quite stable. They may do some damage, and probably they may have the wrong policies, maybe even including Spain for the moment. But this will not really harm the quality of democracy. You can challenge this point as well in the discussion. I come to the last slide so that we have time to discuss and Latin America is a paradigm. This is, of course, a mistake. Is it a paradigm for unstable democracies? Different from Europe. I would argue Latin America for the next 10 years. These next 10 years are quite decisive for the survival of democracy, and here are my reasons for it. They have in many countries quite a weak state, and they have not only a weak state, many of them are extreme weak tax states. They are not able to extract sufficient financial resources out of the society, and especially the richer people, in order to finance the important tasks of the state, not only in the Estado de Bienestar, but even in security. So if it comes to Central American states, the tax revenues of these government of Honduras, Guatemala, is around 10 to 12%. Spain probably is 42, 43, Germany is 48, Sweden is 55% of the GDP comes as revenues into the cash flow of the state. So they are weak tax state, which is a problem for Greece as well, by the way. It's not that much a problem on the expenditure side. It's even more a problem from the revenue side, would be my argument, and it is much more in these countries like Latin America. As I have said to you, the rule of law is one of the weakest spots, and there is a high inequality. These are the most unequal countries. Can only be compared to Nigeria, and, quite interesting, South Africa. South Africa did not change after 16 years of democracy, did not change the inequality of the country. If it comes to aggregate indicators, nothing. This is something, if you think about a party which has a constitution-changing majority. The ANC has more than 66% in most elections. They could change the constitutions as they want, legally, with democratic means. But they were not able, so to say, to change the capitalism and the working of capitalism, that it produces something like less, I don't speak about more equality, less inequality. But the argument is, and here we are again with a minimalist and maximalist, if democracy does not deliver, as in many of the Latin American countries did, neither did they improve the security thing. This is the raison d'etre, the Hobbesian reason for the state. It did not change it. On the contrary, if we look to Venezuela, Caracas is now the murder capital of the world, more even than in Johannesburg. And if democracy does not deliver, then why should the people still believe in democracy? Why should the people believe in democracy? They go, they vote one time for the Peronists, one time for the Republicans, or for different parties, but whomever they vote into office, they do not change the ratio of distribution. And we are not talking about, so to say, 50 euros more pensions or salaries. We are talking about those who are completely marginalized, who are not integrated into the societies. So what is then democracy for? And here is a quite interesting parallel. If you look to the first century, the first half of the 20th century in Europe, during this time, the general suffrage, the right to vote, was installed in most of these countries. And they changed the inequality, so to say, by paper stones. Those papers you throw into the ballot box, changed the tax state, changed the social state, and you have quite equal, still equal society even after, during the last 10 years, we have in the OECD countries more inequality. But obviously, for democracies at the end of the 20th centuries, or the beginning of the 21st century, open economies, globalized, embedded in globalized markets, it's extremely difficult to change something in the property relation and the equality. And this has to do with closed and open economies. And this is, for the future, one of the risks for those new democracies who are, so to say, highly unequal, and democracy does not produce the means to change this extreme inequality, which leads to complete different life chances for the people. I leave it with that, and I hope I have not talked too long, and I'm very interested into the discussion.
Bueno, yo creo que nos genera mucha información, también muchos motivos para preguntar. Así que yo sé tu último, y como ya hemos quedado, el idioma que queramos, incluso en catalán, lo traducimos todo. Bueno, todo no. Y si no, comienzo yo. No comienzo yo.
I think democracy is really a hard concept, but it's not too easy to understand how it's developed in different countries like in America Latina. because it's not the same process. We take out the colonialismo and the independence. Europe doesn't have to pass this process either, like in Africa. In Africa, the independence starts in the 70s. It's like is how we can, if we can speak about a democracy, a global democracy, of world democracy. Because if we compare like America Latina, Africa, Asia, Europe, the process are different. And I think if we compare it in this dimension, we don't have the same process like a country, like a continent. I think it's more complex only to say for different parameters, I don't know, point of view. And I want to ask you if we can speak more like if we can have like a democracy in the world, like a more like a countries and continents work together equally or something like this. Yes.
This is probably right at the beginning, the $100,000 question, the global democracy. But I come in a minute to this point. I buy your point of view that the processes are different. But what is not different, according to my point of view, is a certain universal core of democracy. So I hesitate and I refuse to talk about, this is not what you did, but you have it very often. Asian democracies, Islam democracies, or African democracies. This is something very often apologetic. It is done as it was in Asia, especially by Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and others, so to say, we are different, we have different form of democracy. This will, by the way, happen in China, where the people think they have democracy and they will have a quite different, different political regimes. But the way to democracies, and I'm still on the level of national democracy, is certainly a different one. I'm also a bit hesitating about colonialism, not for Latin America. I would not say the colonialism which was somewhere ended in the beginning, the first half of the 19th century still has an impact. Africa is something different because the colonialists constructed artificially ethnicities and constructed cleavages between these ethnicities. What is quite interesting, there's some research about that we should distinguish between different forms of colonialism. So very often the British colonialism was much better in creating education, for example, which is one of the driving force for democracy, and the worst ones are the French, the Belgian colonialists, which did not create these kind of institutions. Now the global democracy. This is something, in a way, already Immanuel Kant was thinking about it, whether there could be a uniform or an acceptable agreement on a certain legal structure. Again, rule of law would be one of the cores of it. We thought there could be international organization which, so to say, could be the embryonic organization of it. Or of course, immediately the United Nations come into our mind. I'm more than skeptical. The Assembly, the General Assembly of the United Nations, you have half of it are not democracies, and they don't want to become democracies. They are coming from governments where you have dictatorships. They will not vote for it. So I don't believe the United Nations will play a major role in it. And even if you look to this Security Council, you have China and you have Russia. These are, at least to be cautious, China is of course still a dictatorship, Russia a dubious hybrid regime. They will not engage in democratization. So even if you look to the most progressed form, this is a European Union. You have a kind of sovereignty pooling of the countries, a supranational embryonic democracy, but with high deficits, with high democratic deficit. You may know the bon mot that if the European Union would apply for European Union membership, they would not accept it because of democratic deficits. So I do see a certain threshold for the moment that I will not expect that there will be, the states will play a major role. If the states do not play, the international organizations do not play, then we like to look to a global civil society. The NGOs, they play to some extent a role, but one should not overestimate it. If it comes to questions like climate change, if it comes to questions like migrations, there's a clear priority of national priorities. And this has a lot to do with democracy. If the United States, the government, the president of the United States would say, okay, I accept what you Denmark and Sweden and Finland propose for climate change. We accept these wonderful plans. He would be immediately voted out of office by the population because the majority of the people do not want it. And they, in a way, this is a democratic responsiveness to the people. They are elected not by the world population, they are elected by their national constituencies. And the more you are economically in trouble, the people will vote for economic matters, not for all the other matters. So there are some different embryonic cores for it, but I don't believe that this is a very straightforward oriented process. And I very much believe that rule of law plays here in this process quite an important role, international courts of justice and so forth, but you will always have problems with the great powers. The Americans will not accept it, and not to say about China. China will, for the foreseeable future, never will accept, so to say, the interference of any international body into their sovereign matters. So the nation state is still vivid, living, and we should keep this potential and should not estimate in a low manner. It is a precious thing we have, but it has to be complemented by some kind of international democracies. But again, sometimes it's better still to look to the national level to improve this and not to wait for this wonderful global democracy.
Sí, mi cuestión era por el papel de los derechos sociales. ¿Dónde están en su exposición los derechos sociales que garantizan la igualdad y, por tanto, la parte de confianza? Es decir, pero no acabo de verlos en su propuesta. Y la segunda cuestión, también, ¿es la sociedad civil un factor externo a la democracia o interno? Es una pregunta que no sé.
Let me start this way. Social rights are sometimes, not only sometimes, internationally recognized as human rights. So, but if you look, and you are more familiar with than I am, if you look to the philosophical discussion, especially the Kantian discussion on it, and even in international law as well, there are different types of human rights. And the core of it are, so to say, the negative human rights, meaning the individual has to be protected from the interference of third parties, especially the state, but also of the fellow citizens. So right to live, right for freedom. And if you are a Lockean, you would also immediately say human right of property. I would be more cautious to put it in the same level as freedom and the right for physical integrity. And then you have a second layer, which is already something below the dignity of the negative human rights. These are the political rights to participate, all what we can relate to democracy. And then you have in the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations a third type of derechos sociales and very much outlined until the human right to have paid holidays you find in the Charter. And if you have such a big array, serious and plenty of different of these kind of human rights, then you destroy to some extent the proper core, according to the meaning of these human rights. Human rights, according to my understanding, are universal because they are human rights. And I don't think since these kind of social rights are to some extent dependent on the resources a society has, they cannot have the same dignity. But the core of your question may be a different one. Do social rights not play an important role for political equality? If we say the core of democracy is political equality, then you can only equally participate if you have at least a certain cognitive level, certain education, and maybe even you are not completely marginalized from the society. Even in the rich countries, we know somebody who is long-term unemployed will be marginalized in the society and also will not participate anymore, even will not go to elections. Therefore, rational politicians have not to be afraid of these long-term unemployed because they don't vote. But as you know, the pensionistas vote. This is therefore each politician is quite sensitive on these kind of electorate. So I would argue there must be a certain degree of social equality, or let's say the inequality cannot be very extreme, otherwise it would harm one principle of democracy. This is the equal, not only the equal right to participate, but the equal opportunity to participate. So therefore one could argue this belongs, so to say, even I was skeptical, this is kind of output of the political production of a political regime, but it becomes a precondition for participation as well. And the Nobel Prize winner of economics, Amartya Sen, for example, put this very high, and he has good arguments. And again, if I would put it then to the case of Latin America, refer it to the case of Latin America, why should one not argue being in one of these barrios or in the city or favelas in Brazil? For them, if somebody comes like Perón or Vargas promising them kind of material improvement, it would be maybe more important than to go to elections where you don't change your individual life. You cannot change it. So therefore, I would agree certain social rights are important preconditions. But if we then start to enumerate, then we would lose probably the ground of a common understanding which social rights are important. And again, continental Europe, Nordic Europe have complete different understanding from the citizens of Oklahoma or Arkansas.
about the civil society, if it's external or internal, civil society?
Here I argue, here probably I'm very minimalist, arguing like Schumpeter, there must be a right. There must be a right that I vote for people, for politicians into the government, and I must have the right to vote them out of the government. This I do think it's quite important. But to say a strong civil society must be an element. You cannot write this in a democratic constitution. And at which degree of civil society, then would be a definitional part? Would you then call these bonding social capital, where you have different communities? If a country does not have these civic cores, it is not a democracy. I would not argue. My argument is they are quite important for the quality and the stability of a democratic system. I also would argue civil society is a place where you participate and where the citizens govern themselves. However, it's a tricky case as well. Many civil society, if you take aside Antonio Gramsci, who has a somewhat different concept, but civil society is very much a liberal concept. And even these nice or not nice social democratic parties then discovered in the 1990s civil society thinking. So civil society could take over some of the social duties and organize them which the state has. So it's a kind of, don't like this expression, but neoliberal retreat of the state in terms of civil society. And if you look civil society, let's take the US American case. Quite a strong civil society, certainly stronger than in some continental European countries. But what you also have, civil society is dependent on a rather high education. It is very much a middle class thing. And the marginalized, they are not so organized, or the lower strata. So it's again more a dominance of the middle classes, and we have to be aware of this. Therefore, I'm probably, this is a German disease. I think strong civil societies are important, but equally important, or even more important, is a strong state.
¿El concepto de embedded democracy tendría un nivel normativo también o sería solo empírico? Porque, por ejemplo, si pensamos en el caso de España hoy, yo no estoy seguro de que estuviera con los 10 puntos que le clasificaría como embedded democracy cuando miramos a la falta de división de poderes, sobre todo a nivel del poder judicial, y luego hay un 20% de desempleo, que creo que también juega un rol a la hora de definir lo que es un embedded democracy.
There is no common understanding of it, whether civil society, at least in the scientific debate as I perceive it, there is no common understanding whether there is a normative core. But I would argue there must be one. And my normative core is refrain from physical violence. This is not only, this is a tricky case, of course. Resistance movements, for example, can be then under certain conditions not subsumed under civil society. But if civil does not lose completely its meaning, then it must be civic, it must be civil. And must not be violent. So my argument is civil societies must have a normative core and they should refrain from violence against third people. But this is something which is not always accepted by everybody, but certainly by the more sophisticated versions like with Jürgen Habermas, who would not deny that in certain circumstances there's a right to resist and even to rebel against unjust dictatorships, no doubt. But I would not subsume this under civil society activities. These are different, important one, normatively completely justified, but according to my understanding, if everything can be subsumed, then the term loses its meaning. I give you another example. In Western Europe, you have, during the last 20 years, we talked about it, and even stronger now in Eastern Europe, right-wing populist party. Nasty right-wing populist parties. And they are not only parties, they are to some extent civic, or let's not call it civic, societal organization. And their target is immigrants out of the country. So these are the very problematic cases. Even they do not use violence, probably we have to accept then. So I'm clear, I would then these, even the nasty ones, if they do not use violence, would accept it as part of the civil society. We may not like it, but the people organize themselves away from the state. They do not use violence. They have an understanding of human equality which we do not share. But I would still, the National Rifle Association in the United States, 3 million. These are to some extent quite militant people. But as long as they do not use violence against each other, I would count them under the civil society. Probably then we have to think, and there is some literature on it, that civil society is, as democracy, not everything what is nice. There are dark sides of civil society. So Hamas is a civil society organization inside, but it loses this character if it acts again by violence against Jewish people, for example. This is my argument. Or even more tricky is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, let's take the case of Poland in the 1980s. Very important for strengthening Solidarność against the regime, and the Pope as well, quite important figures. And this was, so to say, the ideal concept of the East Europe, was a rebirth of civil society in Eastern Europe during the 1980s. But when then the Catholic parties became, so to say, state, or after the election, and these conservative parties came into power, and the church very closely moved to state power, arguing no abortion, no divorce, and so forth. They are, so to say, hard to lose the character of a civic organization because they moved too close to the state. This is an understanding, but again, if you talk about civil society, probably you know it. You have to write the first 20 or 30 pages, and as in a doctoral dissertation, probably the first half of the dissertation, you explain to the rest of the world what you mean by civil society. But I repeat it, for me there is this normative core, no violence against other people. Sí, espero.
Volviendo al caso de Latinoamérica como paradigma de democracias inestables, las razones que nos pones aquí son razones internas del país. A mí me gustaría saber si también estudias las razones que puede haber de intereses de democracias estables en mantener esas democracias de Latinoamérica de manera inestable. Es decir, ¿a alguien le resulta rentable que esto continúe así? Porque intereses hay muchos y a veces muy, muy claros, muy obvios. Entonces, ¿qué papel tiene eso en que una democracia salga de esa inestabilidad? Que las otras democracias, ¿qué hacen para eso, ¿no?
I don't believe, and you then should give me some examples that democracies are interested to have other democracies not being stable. There are certain reasons for it. Democracies, stable democracies have the best trade. They have trade with dictatorships as well. This is clear, we know enough and sufficient about it. But the most stable trade relation have those regimes which have, so to say, have the same character, the political character. Though this is one reason. A second reason is, to paraphrase Kant, republics or democracies do not go to war against each other. And why should they have an interest to have unstable democracies? And instability always involves the risk that they don't remain, by the very definition, unstable democracy. They could become, so to say, they could become dictatorships as well. And then you have all these problems in international relations which you do not have in the same intensity among these democracies. I think there was a strong, during the Cold War, the democracies were very much interested, or some, especially the United States. Chile, of course, is one of the enigmatic cases, very much interested to have their people in power. And they did not look that much whether these are democracies or democratically elected governments or dictators. So we know that the United States played a quite relevant role in the golpe of Pinochet. And we know the United States played even a certain role in 67 in Greece. There were plans by NATO and the colonels of which took over power in 67 followed plans of the NATO. But this was a very specific historical period. And they were not interested in unstable democracies, they were interested in stable dictatorships, and they preferred stable dictatorship compared to unstable left-wing democracies, so to say. But today I do not see a rational argument, and I even see not an empirical case why stable democracy should be interested that other democracies remain unstable. I simply don't see it.